Welcome to the Elaborate Topics podcast, where we focus on lab-specific strategies for medical laboratory professionals. We're proud to be the healthcare detectives that work behind the scenes to get the results needed to influence medical decisions. Let's grow together and jump right into the lab.
Welcome to another episode of Elaborate Topics. We are your hosts, Tywauna Wilson, Lona Small, and Stephanie Whitehead. Elaborate Topics is a weekly show where we bring you practical leadership and technical strategies that you can use both inside and outside of the laboratory. We have another awesome show for you today. This one is a little bit different from the shows that we typically talk about, but it is exciting nonetheless. So if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. We have tons of episodes for you to catch up on, over 100 to be exact. You can find it on directimpactbroadcasting.com or your favorite podcast platform. Do us a favor, go to whatever medium works for you, hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. New episodes release each and every Tuesday. And share it out because sharing is caring. So share it with a friend, share it with a colleague who needs to listen to this podcast. So we have an awesome roundtable for you today. And I love our roundtables because it's an opportunity for us to get together and we give our experience with the topic and give you a few tips that you can use. So today, guess what? We are getting new equipment. That sounds, I don't know about you, but when I'm in the laboratory and I hear we are getting new equipment, especially if the equipment that we had has been giving us issues, I am like, woohoo, this is awesome. But then I start to think about the work that goes into it, and I'm like, ooh. So we are getting new equipment, and you're probably wondering, how do I select the best instrument for my laboratory? So we're going to talk about that. Going to give you a few tips and tricks that you can go back and use, whether you are tech on the bench. These are things that would be helpful for you. Whether you are in management, these are some additional considerations maybe you haven't considered in the past. And so thinking about your instrumentation, thinking about, why, what am I even selecting for? What instruments am I even selecting for? And so you have a couple of options. You have your what is the instrument for? So is it for your screening purposes? So your screening tests could be those of your BMP or your CBC. So these are tests that are typically large in quantity. And so you are looking for tests in which you can perform a screening, or you're trying to figure out a particular analyte, if an analyte is present, such as, is cholesterol in here, or I'm looking for a tumor marker, CA125, for example. Or you have to look if your equipment for confirmatory purposes. So you have already screened, but now you need instrumentation that's going to allow you to confirm or definitively say what you're looking for. So this will be done post-screen. So when I think about definitive or confirmatory equipment, I think about toxicology testing. I think about drug testing. So your definitive measure could be your liquid chromatography mass spec. So you would have done your screening for your drug screens on an immunoassay platform. And then anything that maybe comes up positive there, you would go on to a definitive route, which could be your LC mass spec, and you're looking for particular drug metabolites. So you have to figure out what you are looking for in regards to the instrumentation. What purpose is it serving? And then after you think about what purpose that it's serving, you want to think about your key stakeholders in this process. So you want to think about who should be involved in this process. Your management team, very important. You need to have your management buy-in, because usually your managers or your administrative team are going to have the final say so. Your technical leaders, your technical team should have some say in the process. They are stakeholders. Those are the people that are typically running the equipment. And so you want to make sure that you have the technical buy-in and have that input. Then you also want to have from your medical director or your pathologist team. So there are certain things that they are wanting to know in regards to the equipment that you choose. And so those are some of the key stakeholders. It could be other hospital administrators that could be have an interest in the instrumentation that you choose, more so of its capability. More so, is it competitive with what is known as the gold standard in your industry? And then I also think about, so we think about kind of what is the purpose, we think about our stakeholders, and then we think about, well, why are we getting new equipment? So are you getting new equipment because yours is old? Possibly. Could be that it's time to replace it. So, and Stephanie will talk about this more in regards to capital or lease, but maybe you've had your equipment for 7 years, 7 years. If it's 10 years, you definitely need to be looking at new or replacement equipment. Maybe it's emerging technology that's out there. And so it's time for you to look at equipment because there's something new. So over the past couple of years, as you all know, we have been dealing with COVID. And so vendors have come out with their platform, emerging technology, and every lab wanted to be on the forefront of testing. And so that was a reason for new equipment, because the environment drove the need for that technology. So sometimes it's the age of the equipment, sometimes it's emerging technology, sometimes it is your community, your population. Maybe you need to think about another platform because your current platform is not meeting the needs of your particular population. You also need to think about throughput and turnaround and expansion opportunities. So those are reasons for why you may need other equipment. And one thing people don't think about, that I had this happen to me in my career, and I hadn't thought about it, is clinician decision. And so I know at a previous organization, we had a clinician that was very familiar with an emergent technology in coagulation testing. And part of his contract of being able to come to our particular hospital was that we had to have this particular equipment in-house. So at that time, it was one of the first labs that I worked at where we were implementing the TEG technology and coagulation. And this was at least, 10 years ago now. And so part of that was that this particular clinician, he had came from Texas, and he was already familiar with that. And so he's like, listen, I need to, as part of me coming to your organization, this is one of the things of testing that I need to have available. And so that was one of the reasons that we looked into that particular equipment. And eventually we got that equipment. So sometimes people don't think of why we are getting certain equipment and the reason behind bringing in some of this different technology. And so it's exciting for sure when you're able to get new equipment, but there is a lot of things that go into it in regards to stakeholders, in regards to the methodology and emerging technology, in regards to, is my equipment old? Another consideration too is if you are becoming a system or multi-site operation and you want to standardize across all of your locations, you want consistent methodology, well, then you have to look at vendors that are able to provide equipment that's able to meet the needs. So in my role, I have 5 hospital sites, 1 core reference laboratory, and 2, soon to be 3 freestanding emergency departments. And so, from a chemistry standpoint, I needed a vendor who could provide equipment in a high volume core or reference type of a laboratory, as well as in our very low volume freestanding emergency departments, as well as in our hospital setting. And so a lot of vendors were not able to provide equipment that could play nice in all of those spaces. So those two are other reasons to think about when selecting the best equipment for your particular operation. Ladies, any thoughts around that?
I think you gave them a lot to think about. I think also if you're looking at this from the larger scope, make sure that you include your laboratory medical team. So if you've got section chiefs or medical directors over that area, a lot of times they want to see the data on validations or white papers, or they want to understand the methodology so that they can help communicate that to their clinical colleagues that might be working with it. So definitely make sure you're including your pathologist.
Absolutely. And that's critical, because you definitely want to have that buy-in from your pathologist, from your medical directors, from that team, because it's going to be critical. But you really want to have buy-in from all levels, from your medical team as well as your technologists, because the technologists play a huge role in it. And so I know that Stephanie, you're going to talk about the kind of the administrative or managerial points of instrument selection, and then Lona will talk about some of those technical considerations that we need to make sure that we consider when we are getting this new equipment. This, again, super exciting, but there's a lot that goes into getting an instrument into your laboratory.
Well, like Tywauna said, we all like new toys. But if you are the manager or the administrator in this decision making process, your role is to have the entire picture in your view. You're not just looking at the instrument, you're looking at the entire big picture. So make sure that you get a pen or write some of these down, because I've got a lot of tips coming your way. Also, use your network. I live in Texas, and so if Tywauna was implementing the tag from a doctor in Texas, he might have came from my facility. We use a tag. And so use your network, reach out. This is where LinkedIn, going to those conferences, being on Twitter, creating that network comes in place, because the vendor might not tell you everything that you need to know. So make sure you have that network of people that you can reach out to during this process to help alleviate some of the headaches. So the first tip is to look at costs. You want to look at your capital versus your lease versus your reagent rental versus your cost per reportable. There are so many purchasing options out there for new instrumentation based on your volume, based on the size of the equipment, based on the terms and the conditions that you need the equipment for. So make sure that you're working with your finance team at your hospital to understand what your organization is willing to do versus what the vendor can provide to you. Running off some tips I have about costs. Make sure that your organization can afford a capital purchase if you're doing a capital purchase, or maybe they want to take a monthly operational cost. So understand what is your budget and what are you projecting. If you take on a monthly operational cost, that could be for the next 5 years or 6 years. And so make sure that you're kind of calculating that into your current and future budgets. And then how does this facility bill? Do they bill monthly? We've had some vendors who bill us weekly. And so you want to make sure you're also working with, like I said, your finance department, your purchasing department to understand what does that financial picture look like, so you can explain that to the other departments that you're going to be working with as a manager. Consider the technology increases. So as technology moves on and gets upgrades, are those upgrades included in your contract, or are you going to be paying for those? Sometimes if this is a capital purchase, you bought the piece of equipment. If you end up needing another piece of equipment, say a sample handler comes out, or a decapper comes out for your chemistry instrument, something to help it move along, maybe a a separate centrifuge that attaches to your track or something like that in chemistry. Are those upgrades a part of your agreement, or will you be having to buy all of those things separately? Because that can certainly add up. Those bills can certainly add up. Ask the company before you make any decisions to provide you a price list for the supplies and reagents. Is the equipment super cheap? But then when you get into the supplies and reagents, that's where they then switched it up and did the okie doke. Are they going to be tacking on additional fees? So we've had some vendors who there is a delivery and freight fee involved. And especially right now, many states are struggling with shipping and supply shortages. So are there additional fees that you are not aware of? Because you'll need to calculate that into your budget also. Does the company supply the reagents, or are they supplying their reagents through a third-party vendor? So are you working with them to get your reagents, or are you working with a third-party vendor? And what is the reliability of that third-party vendor? You definitely want to know that. And then in the future, if new assays come out, say I get this chemistry instrument, but then I get a physician, like Tywauna said, that wants us to add an assay or a new test to this instrument, is the company able to provide you validation support, a consultant, the supplies, the materials to validate that new test at no cost? Or is that validation equipment going to be at a cost? Because, in the laboratory, we're constantly validating new tests, new methodologies. And so are you going to be having to buy those validation kits and those supplies at your own cost, or will those be provided to you? And that's a consideration too, because sometimes your pathologist might not like what the data looks like. You may not end up going with that test, but then you've bought this validation material. So you want to make sure you consider all of those in terms of cost. The next biggest thing you want to consider is the LIS. And this is a huge consideration. And I think when you're looking at equipment, this can make the difference as to whether you go with one or another. One of the things that we love to ask for in our facility is when we're buying a new piece of equipment, does the vendor provide an LIS reimbursement or allowance? And a lot of times they do. So our organization utilizes Epic. So the laboratory is on Beaker. Our blood bank department still operates on Soft Computer Company, or SCC. So a lot of times when we get new equipment, the vendor will give you maybe $10,000 as a LIS reimbursement or allowance to build that interface or to build that LIS with that company of Epic or whoever your LIS is with. So be sure that you ask for that. Sometimes you ask not, you have not because you've asked not. Is there a middleware required? And is that an additional cost? And then you may want to also get with your IT department, because I know many IT departments, with all of the healthcare hacks and all of the people, stealing information for Bitcoin now, are, may have different security rules with their IT and their firewalls and things like that. And so is IT involved in what these new middlewares will be, or what these new IT requirements will be? And simply, can it interface? Am I going to be doing manual resulting now, or can I interface this test? Also, do they provide LIS technical support in terms of the install and the setup and ongoing support for this instrument? And can you train my staff? Can I get a primary operator trained on how to operate the equipment, this middleware for this instrument? And can I get that at no cost, or will that be additional cost? When you train them, will it be on site, or do you have, your main corporation in Dallas or Delaware where I'm going to have to send my tech to for training? And again, is that travel at no cost, or will you? So there's a lot of considerations here. And really, and it's not a LIS portion, but it's really after you've implemented the data that comes from the LIS. So will you be providing us with annual business reviews or regular business reviews so that we could help get some of the data on how this instrument is operating? And I love to ask this question of vendors, because it is nice for me to go back and review with the vendor. How many downtimes have we had? How much time have you saved us on turnaround times? All of this data, can we review it at a periodic basis and see how your instrument is performing in the laboratory? You obviously want to look at, when you're choosing an instrument, that upfront cost of not just that instrument, but any laboratory renovations or safety considerations. And we got hit with this one time in our chemistry area, implementing a new instrument, and then found out we were going to need new drains and then all of this different ventilation and all of these different electrical poles. And those costs, and although they weren't a part of the equipment, were additional costs that were not factored in that we had to explain. So definitely understand, what are the specs of this instrument? Do I currently have the plumbing? Do I currently have the storage needs for all of the reagents? Am I going to need a biohazard cabinet or something that I don't currently have that I will have to purchase? Will I need more IWAS stations? Will I need improved ventilation? If you're going through your histology area and you're installing a new grossing station, do you have the proper ventilation? So it might be time for your quality person to jump in here and help you do some safety audits in this equipment. What is the skill level of the technologists using the lab equipment? And is that sufficient? Or will the end users need to be trained? Is there unlimited access to training modules where we can help update our SOPs? But also with technologists, if I get this equipment, will I need more technologists? Is this going to require a bunch of extra maintenance, a bunch of extra throughput issues where I'm going to need more technologists, or maybe more clerks, or maybe more processors? Or am I going to need less technologists? Not an easy management decision to make, but sometimes, especially in micro, when you look at instruments like the WASP, that can read microbiology plates for you, sometimes that saves you on NFTs. Not saying that you necessarily need to fire anybody or eliminate people's positions, but you may be able to reassign them or help them to work on other critical tasks. So it's great to understand, after I implement this, how will it change my FTE structure? How will it change the employees that I currently have, for, positive or negative, I guess, however you want to look at that. Clinician needs, you want to look at your future clinician needs and your present clinician needs. So does the instrument have the full panel of testing that you need in both stat and routine mode? What is the specimen of choice, and what is that unit of measure? So we recently implemented high sensitivity troponin, which was a completely different unit of measure than what our cardiologists were used to. And there was a lot of extra education they had to do. Some of their standards of care and some of the algorithms they were using needed to be modified. There needed to be a lot of conversations between the cardiologists and the EC physicians when they were doing stroke alerts or heart alerts. Are you certified in any of these? Our hospital has a stroke accreditation and a heart accreditation, and how does this new test impact that? So you may need to pull in other stakeholders when you're looking at certain tests and how those tests may change. What is the collection stability? Will the collection stability, I think our new chemistry instrument has a refrigerator, on deck. And so the collection stability was a little bit longer. And then finally, you definitely want to look at the service. And so once we get this in, and it is 3:00 in the morning on a Saturday morning, which happens to be a holiday, and it goes down, what does our service look like? So you definitely want to ask, what is the pricing for your service plans? And explain the service coverage types. Do I need 24/7? Do I need Monday through Friday? What type of service? Depending if it's an instrument that you're batching and you're not running every day, maybe you don't need 24/7 service. But if it's something that you're, like Tywauna said, using the screen and you're pushing through CBCs and chemistries, you want that 24/7, and you want that telephone tech support, and you want a local representative who can be en route on their way. You don't want to be down too long. So what is the response time for service and repairs? If there's parts, is the company paying for the parts? And, how quickly can we get those parts? Like I said, are the service representatives local, and how long does it usually take for them to respond to on-site work orders? Right now, when we're in times where COVID testing is still very priority, you don't want to be down on your Roche instrument or your Panther instrument for too long and unable to provide that COVID service to your patients. Again, are there printers included in the annual service? So a lot of times Most of the instruments around the laboratory have a printer attached to them or a monitor attached to them. Is there service on those additional pieces of equipment? Or are you going to be constantly buying new printers and new monitor and new keyboards? Does the vendor provide instrument validation support? And a lot of times they do, but you want to ask what is that type of support that they provide. But I think the most important thing you need to do is get your frontline employees involved. Your frontline employees are going to be able to tell you exactly what they need, exactly what's wrong with what they have, and exactly what they're looking for. And so Tywauna is going to give you a couple of tips on if you're a tech on the bench, or if you're a frontline employee, if you've got those technical considerations for your instrument selection, what you should be looking for. Oh, Lona.
Okay.
Lona's going to give that. I'm sorry.
All right. So I'm going to talk about technical considerations. And I know there's a lot of the things that the technical considerations that may overlap with some of the things that the administrators would still have to take into consideration. And that's why, like Tywauna say, the stakeholders have to be all part of a team when you're making this decision. So when you're making any decision, yes, you're having the lab exec to look at pricing, look at cost, look at a lot of those maybe logistic things. But then there are the technical considerations, things that are really technical about the testing that maybe a lab exec or maybe someone in administration may not have privy to. So that's why it's a team. So you're looking at lab exec, you're looking at technical directors, the directors that are specialized in those testing, that understand the test methodologies. So making sure that you're including, like Tywauna Stephanie would say, the pathologists, but a lot of these may not be pathologists. They may be the PhD directors who are specialized in these areas. And they are very vital when it comes to making decisions about having equipment or any testing platform. The managers, the frontline users, the quality, the process improvement specialists, the hospital departments and physicians. So like I think Tywauna mentioned that they may be requesting a certain type of test based on what we offer in the hospital. So a lot of those are technical considerations. Any subject matter expert should be involved. And so in order to make these decisions, you draft a list of these technical considerations, and you're getting that from all the stakeholders. So it's important, and a lot of these technical considerations I'm not going to repeat because I think Stephanie was talking on behalf of the administrators. A lot of those are already mentioned, but in terms of technical stuff, you're going to be basically drafting a list once you sit down in a forum or a focus group and ask the stakeholders to weigh in and document these criteria that are important to the decision. So if you're getting an equipment, you want to know the test that's going to be run on the equipment. Is it possible that you can consolidate? These decisions are usually made by the technical directors, whether or not you can consolidate on a certain type of equipment, certain testing. We're talking about, I'm going to move fast for things that were mentioned before that were technical considerations, things that maybe tests that are outdated. You have to look, is this methodology outdated or is this state of the art? Somebody's mentioned the troponing I or troponing T, the sensitivity of the test. A lot of these, the technical directors are making decisions about these. They're having discussions with the vendors and the specialists at that company about sensitivity and specificity of the test. Are we going to have to change reference ranges? The safety of certain reagents that are used, the specimen type that's used for that particular test, is it whole blood or serum, or do we have to change our whole specimen type? whether or not that equipment can work with the type of specimen that we usually use, the effect of hemolysis or hemolysis indices. There's a lot of things that technically have to be considered, whether it's affected by different pre-analytical variables and transportation. And Stephanie mentioned this, the setup time. When we get this equipment, how long is it going to take for us to set this up? And is it easy, like adding just a modular, or is it a whole line? What's the throughput for that instrument for the testing and the needs of the providers, because they're part of this, they're the stakeholders. Is this going to be okay for the ED providers? So we want to know how fast this instrument is when it comes to moving these specimens through. Stephanie mentioned the type of personnel, moderate or high complexity personnel, available training, what type of supplies do they give, what's the reputation of the company. A lot of that has to do with considering that equipment, and a lot more that may have been repeated in terms of the footprint, the space layout, any changes that would affect other lab areas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you actually work with these technical considerations when you're looking at your stakeholders, the lab executives, the technical directors coming together. How do we make these decisions? Because I know we're like, okay, check, 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 but there could be a lot of different instruments that you're trying to make a decision about that may have a lot of the same things. How do you really make that decision to choose an instrument? So one practice that I would suggest is to have a list of these criteria that you'll get from the group that's important, especially from the technical directors that knows about the specificity, the reference range changes, the specimen type, and all that that's important. Get a list. And once you get a list, have each stakeholder give you a weighting for each consideration. So for each criteria, it could be how important is this criteria to selecting this instrument. Looking at importance, importance and the impact that it will have, and probably say low importance, low impact, maybe 0, give it 1, 3. For each criteria, you're giving it a weighting. And the ones that have the highest weightings, those are the criteria that you're going to use. So you're going to reduce the list and start looking. You already checked off everything that's on all the instruments. So you only have a short list now that you're going to work on. These are things that are very important, and these are the high ratings for, say, throughput. If throughput has a 5, you're going to make sure that that's selected. So the ones with the highest rating for everyone, you're saying these are the things that are important to all of the stakeholders. And based on that, with the instrument that you have, you start selecting based on the high criteria, the ones with a high number, and choose that. So when you're looking at, say, for instance, there's a vendor that has the same equipment, and we're going to make a choice. We have 3 different vendors, and we have a list of criteria with the highest ratings that are important to all of our stakeholders. We're going to look and say, okay, for this instrument from, say, Siemens, when I look at it and check the criteria and the weight, they have a highest number, because based on the things that are important to us, all of our team that's involved, you're going to have frontline users, you're going to have the technical people, you're going to have the supervisors, and you choose. And that is a non-biased way of making the selection. I know that many times we don't. A lot of times it's based on who has the biggest clout, especially if you're working in situation where there are different hospitals, different groups. Then it may be, okay, this group is the biggest group, so therefore they have the high clout, So therefore, they're the ones that's going to choose the criteria that they want over the smaller sister hospital. But when you include everyone and you have a very non-biased criteria and you have weighting for those criteria, then it's very easy to make that selection. So you're going to choose the things that are really important, and you're going to consider technical things like sensitivity, reference ranges. You're going to consider the stakeholders. And so when you make that selection, it's more on a non-biased selection. So that's my tip when it comes to making a fair selection for an instrument.
Lona, I like what you said about the list, because it makes me think about when you do have a system. So for instance, if you're choosing an instrument and it doesn't run pediatric samples, or it doesn't do minimum sample runs, and that's low incidence for maybe one location that doesn't have a big pediatric population. But for another one, it'd be a high impact, especially if I have like a pediatric ER or pediatric urgent care physicians, or the NICU docs will not be mad if I've got to draw the entire specimen volume on all the babies because you can't run pediatric volume. So you got to really look at what is the incidence, but what is also the impact, and not just the impact to the lab, but the impact to your customers that you serve.
Yeah, I thought you both made some really, really good points. Going back to, I think you mentioned this, Stephanie, when you talked about LIS considerations and making sure that you get those technical specs. So I have had this happen before where we were getting ready to get equipment and we almost could not put it on our network, which would have been a really big problem. And so getting your LIS team, your lab information team, in sooner than later, because due to spyware, due to antivirus, you want to make sure that it has the capability of going on to your hospital network. I don't know about you all's organizations, but ours is very firm. If it does not meet the criteria, they will not put it on the network, which is a really huge problem. And so that was one thing that stuck out to me. Also, another thing that stuck out to me was when you are considering instrumentation, and I love that whole checklist idea. We actually did that in our system when we were bringing on hematology equipment, and we had all of these various sites. And so bringing all of those leaders together with a checklist as they went through each of the vendors for those considerations, because each site had different needs. But one of the things that you can also do when you're considering new equipment, especially if it's going to be a vendor change from who you already have, is ask for references from them. Who do they have that's already have their equipment in operation that they can connect you with, that they can allow you to talk to, so that you can ask those questions too. And sometimes you can also ask if they have accounts that will allow you to come and do a field trip, as they say, or a tour, so that you can see that particular vendor's equipment in operation at another location. So as we were standardizing our chemistry equipment, which was a really big deal, our primary or legacy sites had been exposed to that vendor, but as we had got other hospitals in our network, they were not familiar with that vendor. And so, the vendor was going to be a huge difference from what they already had. So one of the things, the vendor knew that this was a really big deal. And one of the things they did is they set up for us to go to a hospital that's maybe 45 minutes from us, that had all of the particular equipment that we were looking at, not just the chemistry equipment, but also front end automation that we were eventually going to be looking at as well. And so they set up time for us to be able to go to that particular hospital, and we were able to ask them questions. And so I think that was a really good experience for those technical leaders to see the equipment outside of the environment, even for those locations that had that vendor's previous models. I think was really helpful. And so that's something that you may not think about, but asking for referrals. And also, is there the opportunity to see that equipment in operation? And then when I thought about the getting equipment, thinking about that potential for automation, if you will, front end automation. So with our chemistry equipment, the vendor that we decided to go with, it had a huge impact on front end automation and then what we would be able to connect our hematology line to. So even though hematology is another discipline, not under me, it all played a huge part. And so depending on the automation system that we went with, which is a piece of equipment, was going to have an impact on the hematology equipment that we chose if we wanted to connect it to the automation line. So those are all considerations, which is why you have to have those stakeholders at the table at the beginning. And I remember Stephanie talking about cost as you are buying more and more equipment. So say, for instance, you're buying chemistry equipment and front end automation equipment from the same vendor, and maybe another piece of serology equipment from that vendor, and you're putting that equipment at various sites. What kind of volume discount can you get? So those are all considerations that I thought about as well. And sometimes they even have an inventory tracking system. So thinking about new technologies such as RFID tagging is important. And so those are all very important. And then the last thing that it made me think about as you all were talking, it was the facilities consideration, because I had this happen too, in regards to, we went from, at one of the hospitals I was at, we went from dry slide technology to now we had equipment that was plumbed to a water source. That was a huge deal for our particular laboratory, considering we were right above this was at a children's or pediatric hospital. The lab was on the floor right over our NICU, and now we were using equipment that was plumbed to a water source. And we happened to have an incident. Well, somehow or another, the water source got disconnected and water everywhere. And yeah, it was not good news. So, those are things to think about too. Or if there is an occurrence in which you have to turn off your particular equipment. So you have to think about that. So we had to have some service to our DI water supply tank. And our equipment constantly runs water. And so it's like, well, how long can we run without the water tank being filled up? So those are all considerations that you have to think about when you are selecting new equipment.
And obviously, we talked about including all stakeholders. That's really the biggest thing, and inside the lab, outside the lab with IT. But try to understand what are going to be your huge stop gaps. And so IT, we already talked about that, especially since, so many, spyware and hackings have been happening in our hospital. Infection control is one, especially during the pandemic. Infection control put some serious guidelines around, cleaning cloths that you can use and mechanisms. So if this instrument requires a certain type of cleaning product that is not allowed in your organization, make sure that you can or cannot talk to infection control. Obviously, facilities, if you're looking at things like plumbing and water, things like that. And so making sure that you are talking to your neighbors, talking to everybody. And I love this this checklist, because it's not just for instrumentation. We went over things that we also look at when we're selecting a reference laboratory. What is the turnaround time? What are the needs of the clinician? What are going to be the reference ranges? And what are some of the requirements for the future and present? And so you can use these things as you're selecting a myriad of things that we work with in the laboratory. I think we could go on and on, ladies, but we are getting close to our time. So I'm going to wrap it up. If you like what you've heard, there is a way for you to do a testimonial for us. We'd love to hear you tell us how our show has impacted you. and the tidbits that you've gotten from our show. You guys are the reason why we've been doing this for 2 years, and we love doing it. So leave us a comment, join us on our LinkedIn group, connect with us on our social medias, share this episode, subscribe to our show on your podcast platforms or on directimpactbroadcasting.com. Tell us what you want us to talk about next. We love, giving you guys what you'd like to listen to, or just submit a guest form to be on the show. We're looking for highly gifted, talented, engaging technologists, and we know you're out there listening. So submit a guest form and be on our show. But until we talk to you again, everybody have a great day, and come back and visit us.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Elaborate Topics, where your hosts discussed relevant strategies for laboratory professionals. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and listen to us on directimpactbroadcasting.com. Stay tuned for another episode with information you can use to excel in your laboratory career.